Hello. Hi. All right, let's go. Yes. Well, thank you all so much for being here and for having me. I remember I spoke here once before, and the size of my font was much smaller, and I'm really sort of struck by the age 41 font situation that we're doing here. So I'm hoping I can read this without my reading glasses, but here we go. Wish me luck. So, because I'm talking about bodily autonomy and trans justice, I do want to start by acknowledging that we can't even think about bodily autonomy, about reproductive justice and trans justice without contending with the many global catastrophes that threaten not only our bodily autonomy, but our collective survival. And of course, there is no reproductive justice or trans justice without an end to colonialism, to capitalism as we know it, and to militarism. Because our ability to control our bodies is inextricable from the larger global systems of power and control that constrain our lives. And right now in the United States, we face a multi-pronged attack on trans survival. State legislatures have introduced over 500 bills targeting trans people in the last year. 21 states now ban evidence-based, gender-affirming medical care for trans adolescents. 18 of those bills were passed this year, and with new threats emerging on that care every day. And those on the center left feed the far right's agenda to eradicate trans life by legitimizing debates over our bodies, our healthcare, and our lives. And these new assaults that we are facing compound the existing structures that make trans life already so precarious. Systems of surveillance and criminalization, and all of the ways that we are pathologized that have limited our survival opportunities across the United States and around the world. Even in places like New York City, with comparably better formal legal protections, we face fundamental threats to our autonomy, self-determination, and survival. Transforming our economic systems and access to public goods would drastically increase the well-being of trans people, particularly those trans people who face compounding systems of oppression and violence. While as a lawyer, I fight within our legal systems for formal equality, that is to say, to expand existing legal protections to include LGBTQ people, this effort not only reinforces our violent legal systems, but fails to fundamentally transform the material conditions that most LGBTQ people face. If, for example, we had access to affordable housing, to single-payer healthcare, to a living wage and guaranteed income, then the demand for inclusion within existing labor markets would be less urgent. We would not have to seek disabling, dehumanizing, and disempowering employment to protect our healthcare, our housing, and our ability to care for ourselves and our communities. We could dream and demand so much bigger. And the fact that trans people, and particularly Black trans women and trans immigrants and disabled trans people, are disproportionately unemployed and underemployed limits the population-based life chances for our communities, because healthcare, housing, and so many other survival needs are tied to employment. Instead of asking for inclusion within our unjust systems of healthcare, housing, employment, and education, civil rights movements could have, and perhaps should have, demanded wholesale transformation of these systems. Not a right to be free from discrimination in healthcare, but rather a demand for a just health system. But civil rights movements in the United States have reproduced each other's many mistakes. The demand for, quote, rights is inherently a limited project. Rights are a creation of the state and therefore are designed to reinforce existing systems. Instead of disruption, redistribution, or transformation, we end up fighting for the state to see us, to legitimize us. And the process of seeking formal legal protections necessarily absolves the system as a whole. When we argue that it should be illegal to intentionally discriminate against LGBTQ employees, for example, we do not challenge the structural problem with our existing employment models as a whole. Employers can continue to deny healthcare to workers, can fight unionization, can refuse to pay a living wage. Formal equality simply allows more people to appear to have access to a deeply unequal, unfair, and unjust system. It means queer and trans people can also face unsafe, unstable living and working conditions, equal access to a shitty deal. Ultimately, our work as civil rights lawyers and advocates is to not be lulled by the promise of equality. We must recognize the inherent limitations of working within the legal system and remember that it can only ever be harm reduction work to create more spaces for people to work for truly transformative justice, to create space for people to dream beyond the constraints of what the law can offer. At the same time, the fight for economic justice, for radical social, economic, and cultural transformation cannot abandon the fights for reproductive and trans justice. In many progressive political and social spaces, I witness either the explicit or implicit rejection of trans justice demands and broader movements for change. People casually talk about how, quote, the left has gone too far, repeating weaponized misinformation about what trans healthcare is and what it means to be trans, and suggesting that casting aside the humanity of trans people could somehow advance some other political project. Many have been duped into marginalizing fights for bodily autonomy as, quote, culture war demands that detract from true progressive fights. But what is a culture war if not the contested terrain over power that plays out in the public imagination and implicates contrived lines between the private and the public? This not only reproduces patriarchal notions of power within movement spaces, but ultimately undermines the political aims of all economic justice demands. Ours is a constitutional system that was founded to preserve chattel slavery, indigenous displacement, and genocide. At core, every economic and legal structure in our country is embedded with and in service to that history. Thus, the status quo is centrally invested in restraining bodily autonomy as a means of maintaining power. The demand to destabilize capitalism's investment in the sex binary as an organizing principle of the modern family, in centering a head of household, in controlling not only our means of production but our means of imagination, is one that should pervade all of our work. In the coming months and years, the attacks on trans life will grow as far-right governments continue their fascist projects. This is apparent here in the US, in the UK, in Hungary, and elsewhere across Europe. Positing so-called gender ideology as a threat, and by gender ideology, Christian fascists and other right-wing leaders mean the fact of existing and the goal to exist outside of white patriarchal structures of the body and family. Political movements will continue to demonize those of us that exist outside traditional sex binaries. Our histories will be censored and our existence situated as a new threat to both progressive and fascist movements. We must not let it. We are neither new nor a threat. Our future depends on mobilizing against the structures that so successfully divide us. There cannot be full liberation and redistribution without a meaningful challenge to binary structures that constrain not only our imaginations, but our autonomy. So in the service of this goal, I return daily to the words of W.H. Auden in one of my favorite poems, September 1st, 1939. And he writes, "All I have is a voice to undo the folded lie, the romantic lie in the brain of the sensual man in the street, the lie of authority whose buildings grope the sky. There is no such thing as the state, and no one exists alone. Hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. We must love one another or die." More than ever today, we must understand how integrally tied together our liberation and our autonomy are. So thank you for your bold visions and demand for change. I look forward to working with you. Thank you.